Mr. Brooks, over here. Jason, who are you meeting tonight? Jaden, can you confirm the rumors?
You shouldn't be here. Oh, I think I have every right to be here. You always had a choice, and you chose to walk away.
Jason Brooks and Jaden Brooks stood less than 10 feet apart beneath the glittering lights of one of New York's most prestigious charity galas. Around them were billionaire founders, Wall Street executives, celebrities, and philanthropists who had gathered to celebrate generosity, yet the room seemed to fall silent the moment the two brothers locked eyes. Outside, an endless line of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and custom-built supercars stretched along the entrance while private security watched every movement. Reporters whispered to one another, puzzled by a rivalry that had become one of high society's greatest mysteries. These two men had each built billion-dollar fortunes from nothing, but despite sharing the same last name and the same childhood, they had not spoken to each other in years. Then, without warning, Jason finally broke the silence. "Everything I built after you took my family away from me." Jaden's expression barely changed. He looked at his older brother and answered quietly, "You still believe that lie after all these years?" The conversation lasted only a few seconds, but it left everyone wondering the same question. How could two brothers who once promised to conquer the world together reach a point where every glance carried years of pain? Was this really a fight over money, or had someone carefully rewritten the story of their lives without either of them realizing it? Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened between these brothers wasn't the kind of story that begins with billion-dollar companies, luxury estates, or private jets. It began decades earlier in a neighborhood where even tomorrow's dinner was never guaranteed, and where two young boys made a promise that neither believed would ever be broken. The question is, who broke that promise first? I'd like to take you back long before the tailored suits, billion-dollar companies, and headlines that turned Jason Brooks and Jaden Brooks into household names. Long before photographers followed their every move, they were simply two brothers who believed that as long as they had each other, no obstacle was too great to overcome. They grew up with very little, sharing hardships that most people never see, protecting one another through moments that could have broken even the strongest families. They made promises beneath worn-out apartment ceilings and on long walks home from school, promising that if success ever found them, they would celebrate it together. For years, nothing seemed capable of breaking that bond. Then two women entered their lives. Jason fell in love with Maria, whose kindness gave him hope during uncertain days. Jaden found himself drawn to Clara, whose confidence and charm quickly made her impossible to ignore. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of two happy futures unfolding side by side. Yet somewhere along the way, those futures quietly began moving in different directions. Because what happened next has left people asking the same questions for years. Was Clara truly the reason these brothers eventually stood on opposite sides of a room without speaking, or had the damage begun long before anyone realized it? More importantly, was there something Jason chose to keep hidden from Jaden, believing that silence would protect the person he loved most? If you discovered a secret that could destroy your own family, would you tell the truth immediately, or would you carry that burden alone, hoping it would disappear with time? And if the people closest to you began believing lies about your intentions, how long would you remain silent before defending yourself? Sometimes families are not broken by one dramatic moment but by small decisions that seem harmless at the time. As we continue this story, one question remains unanswered. Did these brothers lose each other because of one woman's actions, or because the truth stayed buried for far too long? Nearly 20 years before Jason Brooks and Jaden Brooks became names recognized in boardrooms and business magazines, they lived with their mother, Evelyn Brooks, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of a working-class neighborhood. Their mother worked long shifts as a nursing assistant, often leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark, determined to provide for her sons despite never seeming to get ahead. Money was always in short supply. The brothers wore carefully patched second-hand clothes, shared nearly everything they owned, and learned from an early age that wasting even the smallest amount of food was a luxury their family could not afford. Some evenings, one home-cooked meal had to stretch across dinner and breakfast the next morning. Yet despite those hardships, Evelyn never allowed her boys to believe they were victims. She reminded them every day that character was worth more than money and that the way they treated people would define them far more than anything they could ever own. Jason embraced those lessons almost like a second parent, always placing Jaden's needs ahead of his own, while Jaden looked at his older brother with complete admiration, convinced that no matter how difficult life became, Jason would always find a way to protect him. School, however, was where those lessons were tested the most. Every morning, the brothers walked nearly 2 miles together, carrying worn backpacks that had been repaired so many times the stitching had become part of their identity. While some classmates accepted them for who they were, others saw their poverty as an opportunity for entertainment. Expensive sneakers, designer clothes, and the latest gadgets became daily reminders of everything Jason and Jaden could not afford. Whispered insults eventually turned into open mockery, and on more than one occasion, laughter followed them down the hallway simply because their clothes looked older than everyone else's. A few teachers noticed the humiliation and quietly offered encouragement, while others could only watch as the brothers endured one difficult day after another. Then, after one particularly painful afternoon when a group of students publicly embarrassed them in front of nearly the entire class, Jason and Jaden sat together outside the school until the sun began to set. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Jason looked at his younger brother and quietly said, "One day we'll become successful together, and nobody will ever make us feel small again." Jaden reached out, shook his brother's hand, and promised they would achieve that dream side by side. Years later, college acceptance letters arrived for both brothers, opening the door to opportunities they had prayed for since childhood. Neither of them could have imagined that beyond those campus gates waited someone whose arrival would quietly change the course of both their lives forever. College represented more than an education for Jason Brooks and Jaden Brooks. To them, it was proof that the promise they had made outside their old school years earlier was finally beginning to take shape. The brothers approached campus with the same determination that had carried them through childhood, believing every lecture, every assignment, and every opportunity brought them one step closer to the future they had imagined together. It was during Jason's first semester that he met Maria, a thoughtful and hard-working student whose quiet confidence immediately stood out. Their friendship grew naturally through study sessions, conversations after class, and long evenings discussing the lives they hoped to build after graduation. Maria admired Jason's loyalty to his family and the sacrifices he had made for his younger brother, while Jason found comfort in someone who never judged him by the clothes he wore or the size of his bank account. For the first time in years, life seemed to be rewarding his patience. Around that same period, another student named Clara entered Jason's circle through shared classes and mutual friends. Their conversations remained casual, respectful, and entirely platonic. Jason never imagined that Clara interpreted his kindness as something more, because his heart was already committed to Maria. Weeks later, Clara finally gathered the courage to reveal how she truly felt. Jason listened carefully before thanking her for her honesty, but he gently explained that he loved Maria and had no intention of risking the relationship they were building. He also reminded Clara that family would always come before anything else in his life and that he would never allow his personal choices to hurt the people he loved. Clara accepted his answer with a polite smile and wished him well, leaving Jason convinced the conversation had ended peacefully. Life, however, has a way of hiding the moments that matter most until long after they have passed. Several months later, Jaden introduced Jason to the woman he had recently started dating. Standing beside his younger brother was Clara. Jason paused for only a moment before offering his congratulations, choosing not to mention their earlier conversation because he believed it was irrelevant and did not want to create unnecessary tension. He genuinely hoped Clara had moved forward and found happiness with Jaden. At first, everything appeared perfectly normal. The four spent time together, laughed over weekend outings, celebrated birthdays, and supported one another through college life. Yet every so often, small moments quietly interrupted that picture. Clara's attention lingered on Jason just a little longer than seemed necessary. She occasionally compared the brothers in subtle ways, often praising one while making an almost unnoticed remark about the other. When Maria spoke, Clara would politely interrupt before she could finish. None of these moments seemed important on their own, and Jason dismissed them as personality differences rather than warning signs. But looking back years later, those seemingly harmless encounters would take on an entirely different meaning. The question is, had Clara truly accepted Jason's rejection and embraced a new beginning with Jaden, or had getting closer to Jaden simply become the easiest way to remain close to the men she could never stop thinking about? Graduation arrived with celebrations, photographs, and promises that the future would reward years of sacrifice. But as often happens, life moved more quickly for one brother than the other. Within weeks, Jaden Brooks secured a prestigious position at a respected corporate firm, earning a salary neither of the brothers had ever imagined growing up. Jason, despite graduating with equally impressive results, struggled to find an opportunity. Rejection after rejection slowly replaced the confidence he had carried throughout college. Watching his older brother fight disappointment weighed heavily on Jaden, who refused to leave him behind. He insisted that Jason move into the apartment he had recently rented, reminding him that they had survived far worse together. Jason resisted at first, uncomfortable with depending on his younger brother, but Jaden would not accept no for an answer. Maria appreciated the generosity, believing it reflected the promise the brothers had made years earlier to stand by one another no matter what life demanded. Clara also welcomed the arrangement with a warm smile, offering every appearance of support. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the four of them were beginning an exciting new chapter together, one where success for one brother would eventually become success for both. It did not take long before that sense of harmony began to fade in ways that were almost impossible to explain. Weekends that should have been filled with laughter gradually became uncomfortable. Whenever Maria visited, Clara found subtle ways to make her feel unwelcome. If Maria began preparing dinner, Clara would suddenly insist on using the kitchen herself, questioning every ingredient or asking her to clear the space because she had already planned a different meal. Conversations that began politely often ended with remarks that sounded harmless on the surface but carried enough disrespect to leave Maria embarrassed. Jason noticed every uncomfortable exchange, yet he chose silence, convincing himself that speaking up might create unnecessary conflict between his brother and the woman he loved. Then one quiet evening, while Jaden was still at work, Clara confronted Jason alone. Calmly but directly, she admitted that her feelings for him had never disappeared. She claimed Maria could never understand him the way she could and urged him to leave the relationship before it was too late. Jason's response was immediate and unwavering. He reminded Clara that he loved Maria, respected Jaden, and would never betray either of them. This rejection was different from the first. There was no smile when Clara walked away, only disappointment she could no longer hide. From that day forward, small comments began finding their way into Jaden's ears. She questioned Jason's intentions, hinted that he resented Jaden's success, and suggested that Maria was quietly taking advantage of his generosity. None of the accusations were dramatic enough to raise immediate suspicion, but repeated often enough, they slowly changed the way Jaden looked at his own brother. Then, for the first time in their lives, a simple disagreement between the brothers turned into an argument neither of them would ever forget. Neither realized that this was only the beginning of a conflict that would eventually reshape their entire future. After that first argument, something almost invisible settled over the apartment. The easy conversations that had once filled the evenings were replaced by long moments of silence, cautious glances, and questions that seemed to appear without warning. Jaden Brooks, who had spent his entire life trusting his older brother without hesitation, gradually found himself second-guessing Jason's intentions. Ordinary situations suddenly became reasons for suspicion. If Jason stayed out longer than expected after another unsuccessful job interview, Jaden wondered where he had really been. If Maria encouraged Jason to keep searching for better opportunities instead of accepting the first offer that came along, Clara quietly suggested that the couple was becoming too comfortable living under Jaden's roof. Jason could sense the distance growing between them, but no matter how many times he replayed recent events in his mind, he could not understand what had changed. The brother who had once defended him against every challenge now looked at him with uncertainty, and that quiet change hurt far more than any harsh words ever could. Maria noticed it too. She watched Clara's carefully chosen remarks, the timing of her conversations, and the subtle way she always seemed to influence Jaden's opinion before Jason had the chance to explain himself. One evening, after another uncomfortable dinner ended in silence, Maria gently urged Jason to tell Jaden the truth about Clara's repeated attempts to pursue him. She believed honesty might still save the relationship before the damage became permanent. But Jason refused. He insisted that exposing Clara would only devastate Jaden and destroy the happiness he believed his younger brother had finally found. In Jason's mind, carrying that burden alone was a sacrifice worth making if it meant protecting the family he loved. As the weeks passed, Clara's influence inside the apartment quietly became impossible to ignore. Jaden increasingly relied on her opinions, often accepting her version of events without questioning whether there might be another explanation. Decisions that the brothers once made together were now discussed privately between Jaden and Clara before Jason ever heard about them. The apartment that had once represented hope, generosity, and a fresh beginning no longer felt like home. Even simple meals became uncomfortable, with every conversation carrying an unspoken tension that no one seemed willing to confront directly. Jason found himself spending longer hours away from the apartment, submitting job applications, walking the city streets, or sitting alone wondering how two brothers who had overcome every hardship together could suddenly feel like strangers living under the same roof. Maria remained convinced that silence was only making matters worse, yet Jason held firmly to the belief that eventually the truth would reveal itself without forcing him to expose Clara. He had no idea that every day he chose silence gave the misunderstanding deeper roots. Looking back now, it is easy to ask whether one honest conversation could have changed everything. But at that moment, no one inside that apartment realized how close they were to reaching a point where some relationships become almost impossible to repair. The question was no longer whether the brothers would argue again, it was whether their bond could survive what was coming next.
The confrontation that finally shattered the Brooks family did not begin with shouting. It began with a question. Jason returned to the apartment after another disappointing day of job interviews and immediately sensed something had changed. Jaden was waiting in the living room, unusually quiet, while Clara sat nearby without saying a word. The warmth that had always greeted Jason was gone. After several moments of uncomfortable silence, Jaden looked directly at his older brother and asked a question that Jason never imagined he would hear. Have you been pretending to support me while secretly wishing you had my life? Jason stood speechless. Before he could answer, Jaden continued, repeating accusation after accusation with complete conviction. He claimed Jason was jealous of his career, resentful of his financial success, and only remaining in the apartment because he enjoyed benefiting from everything Jaden had worked so hard to earn. Every sentence sounded strangely familiar, almost as though someone had spent weeks carefully placing those thoughts into Jaden's mind. As Jason listened, the painful truth slowly became impossible to ignore. These were not Jaden's own conclusions. Someone had been quietly rewriting his brother's perception of reality. Jason glanced toward Clara, whose expression remained calm and unreadable. And in that single moment, he finally understood where the accusations had come from. The pieces that had confused him for months suddenly fit together. Every uncomfortable dinner, every unnecessary disagreement, every suspicious question, and every misunderstanding now pointed toward the same source. Maria immediately realized the same thing. She pleaded with Jason to tell Jaden everything, reminding him that the truth, however painful, was still better than allowing lies to destroy a family. Jason looked at his younger brother, the same boy he had protected since childhood, and found himself facing the hardest decision of his life. He could expose Clara's repeated attempts to pursue him and risk destroying Jaden's relationship forever, or he could remain silent and carry the blame himself. Even then, Jason chose his brother over his own reputation. Without defending himself or exposing Clara, he quietly walked into his room, folded his clothes into a single suitcase, and gathered the few belongings that truly belonged to him. Maria stood beside him without hesitation, understanding that some acts of loyalty require painful sacrifice. As Jason reached the front door, he paused only long enough to look back one final time at the home that had once represented hope for both brothers. Then he stepped outside, closed the door behind him, and walked away without looking back. Neither brother realized that this heartbreaking goodbye was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a rivalry that would one day capture the attention of the entire country. Months passed, but the distance between Jason Brooks and Jaden Brooks only grew wider. With no stable job, little money, and nowhere left to begin again in the city that had once been filled with hope, Jason made the difficult decision to leave. Everything he owned fit inside a single worn suitcase. The apartment, the memories, the dreams he had once shared with his brother, and the life he thought they would build together were now behind him. Maria never questioned his decision. She remained by his side, believing that although they had lost almost everything, they had not lost their integrity. Before sunrise on a quiet morning, Jason boarded a long-distance bus bound for another city, carrying little more than determination and the promise he had made years earlier while sitting beside Jaden outside their old school. Back then, they had sworn that one day they would become successful together. Now, Jason was leaving alone, uncertain whether that promise had been broken forever or simply delayed by circumstances neither brother fully understood. As the bus slowly pulled away from the station and disappeared onto the highway, one chapter of their lives quietly came to an end. But sometimes life's greatest turning points arrive disguised as painful endings, and Jason had no idea that the road ahead was leading him toward an opportunity greater than anything he had ever imagined. Meanwhile, Jaden remained convinced that his brother had walked away because of pride and resentment, never realizing how many decisions had been influenced by words he accepted as truth without questioning their source. Clara believed the chapter was finally closed. The obstacle she had spent months removing from her life was now hundreds of miles away, and for the first time, she felt certain that Jason would never return. But history has a remarkable way of bringing unfinished stories back to the surface when people least expect it. Looking back, it is impossible not to wonder whether everything could have been different if one conversation had happened at the right moment, or if one person had chosen honesty over silence. Was this truly the end of two brothers who had once promised to face the world together? Or was it only the beginning of a journey neither of them could have imagined? In the next chapter, a chance encounter will place Jason in front of someone capable of changing his future forever. While Jaden believes his brother has disappeared from his life for good, destiny is quietly preparing a return so extraordinary that it will leave family, friends, and eventually the entire business world completely speechless. If this story has kept you wondering what really happened between Jason and Jaden, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Jason made the right decision by protecting his brother? Or should he have exposed Clara the moment she crossed the line? We'd love to hear your opinion. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. And make sure you come back tomorrow, because in the next episode, the return of billionaire Jason, an unexpected meeting will completely transform Jason's life, setting the stage for a rivalry so extraordinary that no one could have seen it coming. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.